Ready?
Okay, okay.
Okay, this is Gary Clifton. This is July 15th, 2020. I'm in the Antelope Valley Cemetery in Colville, California. That's on the east side of the Sierras on 395, about 10 miles south of the Nevada border. This is the Antelope Valley. We have the small towns of Colville and Walker here. What I want to talk about is how to find graves that have been lost in a graveyard. Although this could apply to farmland, ranch land, any place that you suspect it might be a grave, I'm going to show you an easy way to find it. It will depend on the type of soil you have. I'll explain what's going on. But typically in an old cemetery like this, and I'm the caretaker here along with another fella, is that we have many dozens of graves here that have disappeared. The first graves here date from the 1860s, and except for stone monuments like the one you see me here, which dates from 1876 or so, there were many Indian graves here, and there were graves of people who didn't have enough money to have a stone. They would have wooden head posts or monuments, and they've all disappeared, not naturally. So in this area around me, which you can see, you can pan around a little bit, you can see there's a lot of grass here. Well, this is all just weed patch here. Last year we're starting to grass it in, and we know from old maps there are dozens of graves here in these open areas, but there's no monuments, there's no stones, there's no humps in the ground, there's nothing. It's been planed over a few times, raked and things. So how do you find them? In a typical cemetery deal, you've got two choices. One, you can hire specially trained dogs that can detect a burial, an ancient burial, not a cadaver dog, but an ancient burial. Those exist. Or you can do something like ground penetrating radar. I'm a geologist, I know what that is, I know how the principle of it, but in each case we have prices out for specialists to come here with either their dogs or ground penetrating radar, and it's $2,000 a day. Our little cemetery doesn't have the money for that. But I discovered something when I put these lawns in last year that gave me a clue how I could find these graves, and in the last week I found about 20. I've been very successful. I'm going to show you something over here, and I'm going to explain what happens to an old grave. So let's go over here. I'm going to catch up. Yep, I want you over here, please. Okay, we stand there, please. I don't want people reading the monument. Okay, in front of me here is a grave that dates from 1958. So it's what, 60 years old, something like that? And you can see it is partially collapsed. What has happened here is this is normal water that has just been sprinkled on the lawn. This happens in more recent graves if there's a snowpack and it melts. But what has happened is that this grave has collapsed a few inches. And this is the clue of what you can use in an old cemetery like this. Now, when I mean collapse, I want to be very specific. The reason that this has dropped down a few inches is not because the coffin has caved in or the vault, which in later days people put cement vaults around them. It hasn't collapsed. What has happened is that the soil around here is very hard. This is alluvial fan, it's mostly decomposed granite. And I can only stick this probe in a few inches in the ground like this. In a grave that has been excavated down 4, 5, 6 feet, this was probably done by a backhoe because it's so large, the backfill isn't compacted. And just like if you're putting in a patio and or a new lawn, you put out six inches of soil and then you wet it down, it's going to compact naturally about 50%. So what has happened is that the water has sprinkled on here and it eventually becomes saturated, and under its own weight it dropped a few inches. We've seen this before in the cemetery. What we do is we fill it in and grass it over. But this gave me the clue how to find buried grave or forgotten graves, and I'll show you an example. Right here, these flags are graves that I have found just in the last few weeks. From an old map, we suspected that there was a few graves here next to these stones, and so I put a hose here and just let it drip all night long, just very slowly, and it saturated the ground over the top of this grave. Back over here, Anima. And it saturated the ground over the top of this old grave, of which there is no marker. We had no indication it was here except from an old map, and it caved in. It's caved in actually into a corner. The water started running down. I pulled the water away from it. But that's how we found it. This one is completely lined with stone. I can't get my probe in there at all. So we know there's one there. Another example of where the ground is collapsed over an unknown, a lost grave, is over here. From an old map, we saw that there might have been a grave here. And I let the hose just drip, and it saturated the ground, and you can see it has collapsed. The ground inside the excavation is less compact than the ground to each side. It became saturated and just decreased in volume and just collapsed. So this is an unknown grave, or excuse me, a lost grave. And knowing that the pioneers lined their headstones up pretty much in lines north to south, I am now saturating this ground between this grave and these stones here. I'm testing this area in here. I haven't probed this yet. I haven't seen any collapse, but I'm going to do this all up and down these lines, probably hundreds of locations, to see if I can find any more graves. Now, I have found something. The graves that have collapsed seems to be, because I have one over here, they seem to be from about the turn of the century, 1900 onward. We know there are graves here that are 30, 40 years older than that. And I have a lot of graves here that haven't collapsed, but I've still been able to find them. And that's what this is for. This is a probe. This is a piece of spring steel I got off of an old door. It's only about 3/16 or a quarter, and I cut one end off of it and smoothed it out, made a point out of it. If you can use a probe, don't use anything thicker than that. You don't want something as thick as your finger, or your thumb. You don't want a piece of rebar. You want something nice and smooth. And this is how we find the ones that don't collapse. And I'll show you that over here. Between these two stones, these two headstones here and here, an old map indicated there were 7 graves. They just tried to jot them in on the map. I went through here one by one by one, and I saturated this ground, and I did not have a single grave. Grave collapse. However, what I found is that when the ground became saturated, that my probe could be pushed. You see this? That's the grave. Normally this ground is so hard I would be able to push it in only maybe this far, like over here. But here, and my flag and my nail mark the grave. And it's easier when it was saturated, but you see, there's the grave. So that is how I've located so far 8 graves along this right here. Even though the map from 1970, 50 years ago, only showed 7. It is very likely these are Indian graves, and they had wood monuments in the place of headstones, and they're all gone. So I want to wrap this up. This application works great when you're starting out with ground that is reasonably hard, and then any backfill is always going to be less compact than the ground around it. If you live in an area where there's tons of rain, the ground is saturated 10 feet deep, and if you fill something in, pretty soon it becomes saturated, it's unlikely it's going to retain a contrast. You may have to use something else. But if you're in a dry area here, we're at a 1 mile elevation here, 5,100 feet. And the ground is hard, and we have found that where the backfill is in these graves, it remains less compact even after 100 years. I imagine these graves here date from the 1870s or so, or even earlier. Most of the graves here are 1870s, and they date from a diphtheria epidemic that went through the valley. If you ever visit the cemetery, come down to the low part down here and look around, you'll find many, many graves dating from 1876, which is when they had a diphtheria epidemic go through the valley, and about half the kids were lost. They called it throat disease in those days. So we know there's a lot of people who died in the 1870s. That's very likely when most of these graves were put in here. But they're most likely Indian folks. The graves behind me that you see over here, those are all Indian graves. We have Paiutes mostly in this valley. They've been here for a long time before the first white settlers came here in 1860. So we have mostly Paiute folks here. We have a Paiute lady on our cemetery committee, and we have a few Washoe Indians here. But primarily the 100 more graves that we have down below on the lowest part of the cemetery and in and around these white or these what we call white families, which would be the settlers who had a little more resources. They could, in most cases, have a stone on their grave, and there were some intermarriages here. We know most of the Indian folks did not have the resources for that. The stones you see down there are more recent, but most of them were just simple pieces of wood, and of course they would just rot away after a while. So we suspect that most of these are Indian graves. We'll never find out who they are, but they need to be monumented. We need to know where all of our buried people are in this cemetery, one, for posterity, to honor them, and number two, is that even the lower part of the cemetery we think there's a lot of graves here. We have to be very careful about putting a new grave in here. We don't want to dig anybody up. And a lot of the Indian folks here, they want to be buried down here because their ancestors here go back in the 1870s on marked graves. So they want to be buried down here, some of them. So we have to know where all these graves are, for we don't accidentally break into an old grave. So anyway, that's how we're finding our graves here. It's free. It's just a little bit of water. We leave a hose going all night long, as you see over there, just that little sprinkler. And we do it two graves at a time. I can have 4 or 5 sprinklers going like that, or hoses going like that, and it works. The thing about a dog or a ground penetrating radar, the dogs may raise their hand and say, yeah, somebody's buried here, but you don't know that. Unless you probe, that you can determine that that is a soft spot from backfill into an excavation. You don't know that. And the same with ground penetrating radar. Although I've heard the dogs are very reliable, they're just expensive. This doesn't cost anything. And as I say, the last week I have found over 20 graves. And what we're going to do is we're going to make metal stakes. You can see those white stakes over there, those crosses. Those are made out of metal. I picked up a few 100 pounds of that scrap metal today, and at my farm I'm going to cut them, weld them, and paint them, and then there will be a line of them here and over here, these other places. So I hope that helps people who are taking care of these old places, these old cemeteries. If you've got a source of water, you can do this. And you can also do this on your farm or your ranch land. Again, as long as you've got reasonably hard soil. There will always be a contrast between the soil that is put back in the grave than the surrounding soil, and you have a chance of picking the graves up doing this method. So thank you very much. And you get her? Oh.